This was the last time that a Starship prototype flew, SN-15, 2 months ago. I should know, I was there, and it was an amazing experience, something that I will never forget, even though the rocket disappeared into the clouds and I really didn't see but rather hear it. The sound seemed to be coming from directly over my head, although I'm told that that's a deceptive sort of thing, but it really doesn't matter. The experience was simply amazing, and I shared it with this young kid who happened to be running in front of my camera view and decided to invite him to join me. And both of us were so excited and just looking forward to the moment when this thing would attempt to land, because SN-15 sticking the landing was just about the most important thing to the future of SpaceX that I could think of at the time. As we all know, SN8, 9, 10, 11, one of them came so close, of course, SN10, to actually carrying out something resembling a successful landing. We were hoping that this was finally going to be the one, finally the moment when SpaceX would carry out a successful landing. And although we didn't see it in these moments where these beautiful contrails were spilling off of the fins and off of the flaps, it was something that we knew was coming. We knew that this ship was going to be emerging from the clouds in moments. And sure enough, the engines lit, and there it was, descending under a pretty controlled looking situation. And for a moment, we dared to hope that this was going to be successful. And our hopes were finally fulfilled. We didn't see a huge flash. We didn't see a massive fire, and the smoke cleared, and there it was. And yes, so was a fire. But nevertheless, as the fire suppression system went to work, we were so desperate for this to be finally successful, even though we were pretty much expecting, at least I was, a repeat of SN10. We were so hoping that that wasn't going to be the case, and lo and behold, it was not. SN-15 had accomplished where the previous prototypes had failed, and this program was ready to move forward. But what did moving forward actually mean? SN-15 was supposed to be relaunched, reused, but then it wasn't. SN-16 was supposed to be the next step, and now it's being scrapped. And now the push is to go to orbit. And frankly, this whole sense of urgency is beginning to remind me of a time over a decade ago when SpaceX had a similar sense of urgency, except the financial situation was pretty grim. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, I'm coming to you from Colorado now, unexpectedly, ever since I heard about Richard Branson making his voyage into suborbital space, trying to beat his arch rival, Jeff Bezos. This is an interesting thing to say the least. Yeah, just a lot of pride involved in this, I believe. But I guess in his defense, Richard Branson had always intended to go up on the next test flight to prove to his future commercial customers that this was going to be a safe way to travel into suborbital flight, and that this would be a viable method of space tourism. That having been said, I just don't think he was terribly delighted when Jeff Bezos was looking like he was going to make it first, and now he's going for it. And I intend to be there in person. It's not a tremendous drive from where I currently am, so that is my plan, at least at the moment. Okay, enough about me. What about Starship? I mean, how can I possibly be serious about any of this? I mean, they're throwing up these massive towers right now. There's all kinds of work going on nonstop to hit this orbital goal. Well, the one thing that makes me wonder about this whole situation, as you're going to see in the video, is sort of a mixed group of priorities, as if, SpaceX was going in a variety of different directions at once. First, it was all about SN15 going back into orbit, because after all, Elon has said time and again that we are not going to make it to Mars if we don't have rapid reusability. But then it was determined that SN15 was not suitable to go back to orbit, or that it would take too much work. And so we've got SN16. Seems like things were going according to plan, because after all, Starship only had one landing at that point, so, and on fire at that, so it might be a good idea to do another test, probably, to a higher altitude, maybe add more engines, something, make this sort of a gradual process. But no, that's not what's happening. Now it appears that SN16 is going to be scrapped, and now we have this dash to orbit. Building this launch tower at an enormous rate of speed, building these Pathfinder super heavies. I mean, from my understanding, we still need another super heavy actually constructed before an orbital launch could even be attempted. Now, during that time, there's a lot of other things that could be done, but they aren't being done. And I have to admit, it does make me wonder, are these things not being done because they can't be done? Because there isn't a budget for that. What there's a budget for currently, especially with the 2.9 billion that NASA promised to SpaceX, now very much in limbo, does SpaceX now need to make it to orbit as desperately as Falcon 1 had to make it to orbit? Not to say that Elon himself is in any danger of going bankrupt, but there's some very good reasons why he can't invest too much of his personal funds in SpaceX without throwing a lot of other things into chaos. So, a lot to be discussed here. Now, I must emphasize this is speculation, but nevertheless, I think something that questions that should at least be asked, which is something that I like doing on this channel. So let's get started right now. So this, as most of us know, is where it all started. 13 years ago now, with a rocket that had pathetic amounts of thrust, at least compared to what we're talking about today. This was essentially a small sat launcher. It had a bit more thrust than Launcher 1 on Virgin orbit, but at the same time, it was launching up from the ground and not from 10,000 meters, so really it was only capable of putting small amounts of payload into orbit, which was never its real intent. But this particular flight was actually carrying a cargo. There was a small sat called Trailblazer on board, and also two small NASA satellites, including an ultra-thin solar sail, which was called NanoSail D, and also a micro laboratory called PreSat. So it's not like this thing was carrying nothing. And it was the third launch of Falcon 1 at this point, which everybody was hoping was going to be the successful launch and allow SpaceX to move on to bigger and better things. But at this point, few people had a lot of confidence in the system. The first attempt in March 2006 failed with a fuel line leak and a fire. The second attempt in March of 2007 saw the Falcon 1 get all the way to 289 kilometers. But then the rocket's second stage engine shut down because of fuel slosh and roll control issues. And then this launch, it failed as well shortly after the separation of the second stage. And what few people realized at the time is that SpaceX was on its last legs. Not only had it lost this cargo, it was also running desperately short of money. But if you had listened to Elon at the time, you never would have known that this was happening. Not at all. He assured his employees that SpaceX was going to move forward with a fourth flight, which of course they did, and he also said that SpaceX had recently received a major investment to continue developing Falcon 9, which was considered a heavy lifter at that point, and also the Dragon spacecraft, designed of course to carry cargo and future crews as well. And remember, the space shuttle had not yet been retired at this point, but Elon was confident. Quote, "For my part, I will never give up, and I mean never," unquote. However, this fourth launch that you're watching right now was the make or break for SpaceX, which Elon admitted about 10 years later. SpaceX was close to bankruptcy, and if this flight had not been a success, it would have been the end of the company, unless somebody had bailed them out from the outside. And by the way, the confidence may not have been there quite as much with payload providers, because this Falcon rocket was carrying nothing from other companies, but rather a payload mass simulator weighing about 165 kilograms. No small sats from anybody. Kind of unfortunate, really, because somebody would have actually gotten their small sat into orbit this time. But regardless, it was an unqualified success, and there was a success after this, which, given the future of spaceflight and how much this mattered to the private sector, this was a huge moment. And yet, only 4% of SpaceX's current subscribers have actually watched this video, which comes as a surprise to me, really. But regardless, it was a huge moment. We can't take that away from SpaceX. But now I'm forced to wonder, are we in a similar situation now? Is SpaceX again in a make or break situation, at least as far as Starship is concerned? So why am I thinking this way? Well, it's all based on what's happened since SN15 successfully landed and didn't blow up. I mean, that was a massive moment, obviously, for the future of Starship. And indeed, NASA invested almost $3 billion in lunar Starship to return mankind to the moon. Everything seemed very positive. One thing that made me a little concerned is when Elon said that the $3 billion or so would come at a very good time because this program was so expensive. Did this indicate that funds might have been running low? Well, the fact of the matter is, SN15 should have flown again, or that's what Elon wanted, based on his strong desire for rapid reusability, and yet it did not. SN16 was wheeled out, ostensibly to continue the test flight program, perhaps to a higher altitude to test the heat shield a bit more, since it didn't hold up perfectly during SN15's flight, and also to see whether or not they could make this thing land twice in a row. And yet that's not what happened either. And now the orbital flight plan is not going at all as Elon originally described it.
Hopefully we don't lose it. Hopefully we don't lose any boosters, because that's a lot of engines. Our initial booster flights will just have maybe 2 to 4 engines, not 28. 28 is a lot of engines.
Couldn't agree with you more, Elon. And on top of that, in the same interview, Elon also says that without rapid reusability, we will never get to Mars. Seems to me that SN16 would have been a perfect vehicle to take a second shot at a good landing and also to try to reuse the vehicle, as he intended to do with SN15. And yet, that's not what's happening, not even remotely. It's straight to orbit or bust. No experimental hops or landings with Superheavy, no additional experimental launches with the Starship itself, perhaps to a higher altitude or with all 6 engines instead of 3. Nothing at all. Going straight to orbit with 28 or rather 29 engines, as we are told right now, which, if you look at the context of that interview, that whole concept seemed a little absurd to Elon at the time. And as I have mentioned so many times in the past, there are simply too many risks associated with going for an orbital shot right off the bat that close to South Padre Island and other inhabited areas, on top of the noise issues and other factors. And as a matter of fact, we're not even certain if the FAA is going to approve this orbital launch at all, given the environmental concerns. And they are significant, with a major wildlife preserve only 2 kilometers away. So what does all of this mean? Why this orbital shot, this rush to orbit without any further testing, especially on the most powerful rocket in human history? Is it because Elon is impatient to get to Mars, or is it because he has to get to orbit? And the reason I'm thinking this way is because it's all happened before.
So we only barely survived. I was at zero cash basically when we got that 4th one to orbit. And if that 4th one hadn't worked, we would have been curtains. So it's definitely not been smooth sailing. It's been very difficult.
So, in spite of assurances at the time that SpaceX had received major investments for Falcon 9 and the Dragon, had this 4th launch not gone off successfully, as I said before, that would have been the end of SpaceX. Now, I'm not suggesting that that is indeed the case now, but what I am suggesting is that the funding or the budget that's been allocated to Starship may be running rather thin for a variety of different reasons. And one of the biggest factors has been Starlink. SpaceX has been sending these things up like mad, and the amount of return they've been receiving so far has been fairly minimal. They have roughly 70,000 subscribers right now, which doesn't come close to the amount of money that's been invested in building and deploying this system, not to mention maintaining it as well. So Starlink is definitely a bleeding artery on SpaceX, and they may not have a lot of cash to be spending on Starship at the same time. Large investors in Starship would make a big difference in this equation, but those investors may not come on board until Starship has actually reached orbit, in the same manner that big investors didn't come on board until Falcon 1 reached orbit. Now, until recently, Starship did get its first big investor in the form of NASA and nearly $3 billion. However, even that money is in question right now until the GAO makes its decision. So that is not guaranteed money, and although the military is interested in Starship as well, that may not turn into dollars until, once again, Starship reaches orbit. All of this, to me, seems to be a lot of compelling reasons as to why there is this sudden rush to orbit at all costs. But wait a minute, isn't Elon insanely rich? Doesn't he have more than $100 billion? Couldn't he just fund Starship himself? Well, one of the important things to consider is a great deal of Elon's wealth. In fact, the vast majority is tied up in Tesla stock. Elon currently owns about 20% of Tesla shares, and if he starts dumping billions of dollars of Tesla stock in order to keep Starship running, this is going to have an impact on stock price and also reduce his personal influence on the Tesla board, who may be annoyed at the fact that his sudden sell off might have an impact on Tesla as a company. So it's a lot more complicated these days. Elon is not completely and exclusively wrapped up in SpaceX anymore, as much as he would like to be. Instead, he has other considerations, and spending all of his wealth on Starship, unless he decides to pull out of Tesla, well, let's just say that that would not be an easy thing for Elon to do. Now, all of this is based not just on my speculations, but just also on the fact that SpaceX is a privately held company. I've worked for privately held companies in the past that seem to be doing magnificently on a financial level, and yet behind the scenes, things were not quite so rosy. And publicly traded companies, you can see their financials a lot easier. So, what's going on behind closed doors at SpaceX is really anybody's guess. However, as you're seeing here, this could all be based on Elon's desire to get to Mars as quickly as possible. The whole Starship testing process took a lot longer than he was planning on, and if he wants to reach Mars by the deadline that he has in his mind, then this may be the only way to do it. This could indeed be his primary motivation. But I have to admit, given the current change in plans and how radical these changes have been, and the risks associated with these changes, it's made me a little bit concerned. All of that having been said, though, I don't want to just say negative things about Starship right now. So, this is going to be the first chapter in a 3-part series about Starship. And the remaining 2 chapters are not going to be doom and gloom, but rather topics that are very seldom discussed on YouTube in general, and certainly not on this channel. So stay tuned. Starship is about to take a turn for the better. Now, as always, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. This is not something that I am convinced about at all. These are mere concerns. These are mere speculations on my part. There is every evidence that SpaceX certainly has the revenue to continue with this project as it is and to continue pushing forward at the rate that they've been doing it. But nevertheless, it's starting to strike me as being somewhat similar. Falcon 1 absolutely had to reach orbit in order to convince high paying customers that it was a system worth investing in. And indeed, the moment that the 4th test of Falcon 1 did successfully reach orbit and had another successful flight on top of that, then the investors came in, the biggest investor, of course, being NASA. And the moment that Starship reaches orbit, the investors are going to start lining up as well. Is this what we have going on right now? Do we have a repeat of history? This is the only question that I am asking. Is this mad dash to orbit not because, not solely anyway, because Elon wants to get to Mars as rapidly as he possibly can, but is it because this project is going over budget and there's only so much that SpaceX and Elon himself can actually spend on this before he's going to need to start scaling back? As I said in the video, there are things that SN16 could have done, very useful things, very valid things that could have been done in order to assure the progress of this entire program, and yet it's being scrapped. That concerns me a bit. And so I think it's important, especially since SpaceX is a private company. And so we don't really get to look at their financials. Very few people get to see exactly what's happening with this company. And I know I've worked for my share of private companies who have all of a sudden gone bankrupt, to the shock of just about everybody, including upper management. Once again, not saying that they're anywhere near bankruptcy. However, Elon did use the term bankrupt with his discussion about Starlink, and that alone causes me a little bit of concern. But it is my hope that he has more than enough funds to continue with this program and to get Starship to orbit, hopefully somewhere in the vicinity of his timetable, because mankind's future as a multiplanetary species and our future in terms of colonizing the red planet are pretty much in the hands of this one company and this one guy. In spite of everything else that's going on right now, SpaceX and Starship are pretty much the only way that we are getting the human species to Mars, at least in great numbers. So there's a lot riding on this. And I'll tell you something, until this orbital launch actually happens, and indeed at the moment when it gets going, I'm going to be very much on pins and needles, as are millions of others. If you like my content, if you like the subjects that I tend to bring up, regardless of how potentially frightening or controversial they may be, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. And given that I am going to film yet another launch, it's some help that I could desperately use. So until Starship does make this orbital launch, until this platform is demonstrated as being a valid way to get not only satellites and cargo, but also human beings into orbit and beyond, and then the investors start to line up, until this critical moment happens, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.